To the member for Gellibrand.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Well, we've seen a fair bit of rhetoric this morning, as we always do in sessions of this kind, a bit of cut and thrust, and that's all well and good. But I just seek the Parliamentary Secretary's indulgence to ask a question of earnest importance, and that's a question dealing with the incidence of men's violence against women in our community. And I ask him to take this question from myself as one man asking another man about an important issue that all men should be speaking out about in our community. My questions go to now, these are inherently political questions when we're talking about prioritisation of funding, but I emphasise these are not partisan questions, as I do not doubt the intent of those opposite in curbing the growth of men's violence against women in our community and in fact driving these rates of violence down. My questions relate to two areas of funding and relate to the Office of Women. And I'm seeking guidance from the Parliamentary Secretary about whether the Office of Women provide advice to the government on how this year's budget would impact on services provided to women in danger of family violence. In particular, in the area of community legal centres. Now, we've seen $1.6 million cut in the budget from the Women's Leadership and Development Strategy, which includes the Australian Women Against Violence Alliance, but also $15 million from legal aid and millions from community legal centres. Now, in Melbourne's West, in my electorate, more than 50% of the work of community legal centres is done on advising women in danger of family violence. For the benefit of people who haven't engaged with these groups, this kind of advice includes advice to women on their rights in the legal system to protection, to their rights to intervention orders to ensure their safety, but also what to expect if they made the decision to leave the home in terms of their financial security, the obligation of the government to them and their partners to them to supporting them. So the MyEFO already included $3.6 million. I should also add there's been a 35% increase in demand for community legal centre advice in my electorate in this space. MyEFO contained cuts of $3.6 million from family violence prevention legal centres and $9.6 million from community legal centres, and $6.5 million in legal aid. And I ask whether the Office of Women provided advice to the government about the impact of those cuts on women in these situations, and also whether they took into account the rising rates of domestic violence and increased demand for these services in the community. If they did provide advice, I'd ask what the recommendations of that advice were and whether it was acted on by the government. The second area I'd like to ask about now is the impact of cuts to Medicare Locals funding contained in this year's budget and the impact this has on family violence services. Family violence was a priority area for my Medicare Local in my community. As I say, family violence is an extraordinarily serious and growing problem in my community, and these cuts will have a substantial impact on the ability of these Medicare Local funded programs to continue in our community. I should emphasise these are not cuts to the Medicare Local institutions, these are cuts to the funding of programs being implemented by these Medicare Locals. And again, I ask whether the Office of Women provided advice on these decisions and about the impact of these decisions on women in these situations. I've asked whether the cumulative impact of these cuts to programs that assist GPs in providing advice to women and identifying women in these situations, combined with cuts to community legal centres who are providing advice to women in these situations, were taken into account in the budget process. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Okay. The question is the proposed expenditure be agreed to. The Parliamentary Secretary will make a brief response before we move on. Thank you, Parliamentary Secretary.
Can I thank the honourable member opposite for those questions about a very important topic, because like him, I hail from the state of Victoria, which has been rocked by tragedy in recent times, particularly as it relates to violence against women, and the Jill Marr case is the most prominent example of what is clearly unacceptable behaviour. As I said earlier, this budget continues to strongly support funding programs to prevent violence against women. On the issue of the Office of Women and the advice that they're able to provide, that is done within the context of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and they are able to provide advice on all relevant measures in this budget, and we take our advice from the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. On the particular measures that we are committed to in this budget. As I've said earlier, the funding for the National Plan to reduce violence against women and their children remains unchanged. The funding for this plan is $104 million over the forward estimates, and it continues funding for the Australian National Research Organisation for Women's Safety, the Foundation to Prevent Violence Against Women and Their Children, as well as a number of other measures, including 1800-RESPECT, the nationally funded counselling support line for women experiencing sexual assault and or domestic violence, the DV Alert domestic violence response training delivered nationally by Lifeline, and the Personal Safety Survey and the National Community Attitude Survey. The second action plan, which will include our commitment and that of the states and the territories to ongoing action, will be released mid this year. Now, the member opposite did ask me about community legal centres and funding for that. We continue to believe that funding going forward needs to be structured in a way which does take into account the most vulnerable people in our community, including women at risk. We have extended the base funding under the National Partnership Agreement on legal assistance services by 1 year until the 30th of June 2015. Ongoing future legal assistance will be the subject of consideration, and the findings of the Productivity Commission's inquiry into access and justice arrangements and the recent review of the National Partnerships Agreement will also inform future decisions going forward. When it relates to Medicare locals, the member opposite will be aware that we have increased funding for health in this budget right across the board. In fact, funding for hospitals has increased by, I think, nearly 40% over the coming years. And like with education, with health, there are a lot of fallacies contained in the arguments put by those opposite. We have put more money into education than they ever did, including $1.2 billion for the Gonski proposals that they ever did. And in terms of funding for hospitals, we have continued to promote funding for our hospitals and for frontline patient services. Mr. Acting Deputy Speaker, I'm very proud of this budget. I'm very proud because it pays back debt, because it boosts jobs, growth and productivity, and also because it continues to provide financial support,
you'd like to be here to ask questions in the next
services for those most in need.